The sandbags on Hill 255 had frozen solid by March of 1953, and Second Lieutenant Thomas Herold could press his thumb into one without leaving a mark. They'd turned to something closer to concrete. Herold commanded a platoon of Easy Company, 31st Infantry Regiment, 7th Infantry Division, and his entire world measured about 200 yards across at its widest point. That's roughly 2 football fields of cratered earth, shallow trenches, and bunkers reinforced with timber that splintered when anything heavier than small arms hit it. The hill sat in the Iron Triangle sector of Central Korea, one of a scattering of outposts strung along the American main line of resistance like teeth knocked loose from a jaw. Nobody in the regiment called it Pork Chop Hill yet. The maps said Hill 255. The men called it a lot of things, most of them unprintable. If this kind of history matters to you, the stories of guys like Herold, who held ground that barely showed up on a map, hit subscribe so more people find these videos. Drop a comment if you know anyone who fought in Korea. Hit like. The algorithm buries this stuff otherwise. Herold had arrived in country 4 months earlier, a replacement officer fed into a division that chewed through lieutenants at a rate the personnel office in Tokyo struggled to match. He came from Wisconsin. He'd wanted to be a teacher. The Army had other plans, and those plans involved a hilltop so small that a Chinese mortar crew could blanket the entire position with a single fire mission lasting under 90 seconds. The hill rose about 80 feet above the valley floor. 80 feet. A 6-story building commands more elevation. From the Chinese positions on Hasakul Hill 347, observers could watch American troops move across Porkchop's surface the way a man watches ants cross a dinner plate. Resupply runs, relief rotations, trips to the latrine, all of it happened under direct observation. The Chinese knew when the Americans ate and when the guard shifted. They tracked it all with a patience that bordered on institutional obsession. So why hold it? Why plant American infantrymen on a pimple of ground that couldn't be reinforced without taking casualties, couldn't be supplied without exposing trucks to direct fire along a single dirt road, and offered no tactical depth whatsoever? The answer involves something the Army rarely discussed publicly in 1953, the armistice negotiations at Panmunjom. By spring of that year, both sides understood the war would end at a table, not on a battlefield. Whatever hill or outpost or ridgeline you occupied at the moment the ceasefire took effect would determine the final demarcation line. Ground held equaled ground kept. Porkchop Hill sat roughly 600 meters forward of the main line. Losing it meant the demarcation would shift south. Holding it meant nothing strategically in any conventional military sense. It meant everything diplomatically. The Chinese People's Volunteer Army understood this arithmetic with perfect clarity. Their commanders, and the records from Beijing's Military Science Academy use the phrase political terrain, which tells you everything about how they categorized these outposts, viewed Porkchop as a bargaining chip worth purchasing with infantry. They had the infantry to spend. 5 full armies occupied the sector opposite the 7th Division. Roughly 135,000 troops against a division fielding fewer than 18,000. From Herold's trench, the ratio looked even worse than it did on paper. He had 44 men on that hill. The Chinese battalion designated to take it numbered over 700. Herold didn't know the specific numbers. He didn't need to. Every night, his listening posts reported movement in the valley, the scrape of entrenching tools, the clink of equipment, voices carrying across frozen ground with startling fidelity. Something big was coming. The Division G2 intelligence section knew it too. Their assessment, dated 16 April 1953, predicted a regimental strength assault on the outpost line within 72 hours. The file doesn't record whether anyone passed that estimate to Herold. The Korean War stopped moving in the summer of 1951, and it never really started again. From roughly July of that year until the armistice in July 1953, the front line shifted by less than a mile in either direction, along most of its 150-mile width. 2 years of fighting over the same ground, the same ridgelines and valleys, the same frozen creek beds that thawed each April into ribbons of brown water smelling of cordite and turned earth. By the spring of '53, The hills along the main line of resistance carried a particular odor, wet soil mixed with diesel exhaust from the generators that powered command bunkers, overlaid with the sweetness of human waste from latrines dug too shallow because the rock sat close to the surface. Korean spring was wildflowers pushing through shell craters and mud that sucked boots off feet. The contrast could make a man lose his mind. The static war created its own logic. Both sides dug in along parallel trench systems separated by a no-man's land that varied from a few hundred yards to over a mile. Forward of the main trenches, each side maintained outpost hills, small exposed positions occupied by a platoon or a company, connected to the rear by communication trenches or open ground. The outposts served as early warning, absorbing the first shock of any attack and buying time for the main line to prepare. Everyone on them knew they'd die first. What made 52 and 53 different from the trench warfare of 1914 through 18, the comparison everyone reaches for, came down to firepower concentration. An American Infantry Division in Korea could call on roughly 300 artillery pieces within range of its sector, plus naval gunfire from ships offshore, plus close air support from 5th Air Force. The Chinese matched this with sheer tube count on their side, deploying artillery in caves bored into reverse slopes where American counter-battery fire couldn't reach them. The result turned every outpost battle into a mutual destruction exercise. Both sides could obliterate any given hilltop within hours. Neither side could hold what it obliterated without feeding more men into the wreckage. Panmunjom made this arithmetic lethal in a specific way. The negotiators argued over the demarcation line with maps spread across folding tables, and every hill held or lost moved an ink mark a fraction of an inch. General Maxwell Taylor, commanding 8th Army, later described the outpost battles as a war of posts. His phrase carried the exhaustion of a man who understood he'd spent lives for cartographic adjustments. The Chinese delegation at Panmunjom tracked each outpost action in near real time. Seize a hill at 10 p.m., mention it at the table by breakfast. That pressure flowed downhill to men like Harold, standing in a trench on a hilltop that mattered only because someone in a conference room said it did. At 0300 hours, on the morning of April 2, 1953, Corporal James Keeley heard digging. Not distant digging, the kind that carries as a dull rhythm across a valley floor. Close digging, maybe 200 yards down the forward slope of Pork Chop, where the ground leveled briefly before dropping into the draw that separated the outpost from Chinese-held Hill 347. Keeley reported it to the platoon CP. The duty officer logged it. Nothing happened. The digging continued for 3 more nights. The outpost doctrine that governed hills like Pork Chop never intended them as defensive strongpoints. Field Manual 7-20, the infantry Bible of the period, classified forward outposts as security elements designed to detect enemy movement, delay initial assault forces, channel attackers into pre-registered artillery kill zones, and buy time for the main line to react. Hold until you can't, then withdraw to the main line. That's the theory. Clean and rational on paper, almost elegant. The problem arrived when Panmunjom turned every outpost into sovereign territory that couldn't be abandoned without diplomatic cost. A tripwire you refuse to let trip becomes a fortress by default, except nobody built it like one. Pork Chop's fortifications reflected this contradiction. The main bunkers used 8-inch timber beams for overhead cover, packed with sandbags and loose earth to a depth of roughly 4 feet. Enough to stop a mortar round. Not enough to stop a 122mm howitzer shell, which the Chinese had in quantity. The communication trench connecting the forward observation post to the main platoon position ran about 18 inches deep in most places, deep enough to crawl through, not deep enough to walk. Inside the command bunker, the air tasted of kerosene from the heating stove and damp wool from uniforms that never fully dried. Underneath that, the metallic tang of the EE-8 field telephone batteries stacked along one wall. The floor consisted of ammunition crates laid flat over bare earth. When it rained, water pooled between the crates and turned the dirt underneath into a slurry that soaked through from below. Men slept on that floor. How did the Chinese 67th Division plan to crack this position? Their approach reflected a doctrinal sophistication that American intelligence officers consistently underestimated in the spring of '53. The 67th had rotated into the line opposite Porkchop in late March, relieving the 141st Division after a standard 4-month tour. Fresh troops, full strength, commanded by a general named Piao, his given name doesn't appear in available Western sources. Piao's staff had studied every previous outpost battle along the Iron Triangle sector, going back to Old Baldy in June of '52. They identified a pattern. American outpost garrisons fought hard for the first 6 to 8 hours, then degraded rapidly as casualties mounted and reinforcement columns took fire, crossing open ground from the main line. The key variable was artillery suppression of the connecting road. Cut the road, isolate the garrison, overwhelm them before daylight brought American air support. The 67th rehearsed this plan on a mock-up position behind their lines. A declassified signal intelligence summary from 8th Army's G2 section, dated April 9th, notes intercepted radio traffic referencing training exercises on hill terrain within the Chinese rear area. The analyst who wrote the summary flagged it as probable assault preparation. That assessment moved up the chain to division headquarters at the 7th Division. The operations log for April 10th shows it arrived. The log doesn't show any change in the defensive posture on Porkchop. Harold's platoon continued its routine. Stand to at dusk, 50% alert through the night, stand to again at dawn. Patrols went out after dark, 2 or 3 men moving down the slope to check the wire and listen. They came back reporting the same thing Keeley had heard: digging, movement, the smell of fresh-turned earth drifting uphill on the night air, mixed with wood smoke from cooking fires the Chinese didn't bother concealing. That detail irritated Harold. Concealing your fires means you fear detection. Letting smoke drift toward an enemy position means you either don't care or you want him to know you're coming. Neither possibility offered comfort. By mid-April, Harold had 44 men, 6 automatic rifles, 2 60mm mortars with limited ammunition, and a radio that worked intermittently in the bunker because the overhead cover interfered with transmission. The Chinese battalion assembling below him carried enough explosives to breach every bunker on the hill in a single coordinated rush. Piao's plan called for exactly that. Harold pressed the field telephone handset against his ear at 22:10 on the night of April 16th and heard nothing but static. The landline to battalion had cut out sometime in the previous hour. Shell fire on the connecting road, probably, though the cause didn't matter much when the result meant silence. His only reliable link to supporting artillery now ran through the SCR 300 radio, which picked that evening to work. Small mercy. The alarm system on Porkchop could have been a footnote in the history of military improvisation. Someone in easy company, the name is lost, had run a length of field telephone wire from the command bunker to the hull of a knocked-out M4 Sherman sitting at the base of the hill's eastern slope. The wire connected to the tank's horn. When the listening posts spotted movement, they'd crank the phone, and the Sherman's horn would bleat across the hilltop like a dying cow. The French had rigged something similar at Dien Bien Phu, using truck horns wired to observation posts along their perimeter. Though that battle wouldn't reach its crisis for another year, the problem of alerting scattered positions without reliable radio produced identical solutions on opposite sides of the continent. Back on Porkchop, that horn sounded at 22:35. Private First Class Robert Gruber, manning the forward listening post on the northwest finger, cranked the handle twice. The horn groaned. Gruber later told S.L.A. Marshall, the Army historian who interviewed survivors within days of the battle, that the Chinese came up the slope like they were walking to church, real steady, no running, until somebody fired, and then the whole hill turned white with muzzle flash. Marshall recorded that phrase in his field notebook. The 201st Regiment of the 67th Division committed 2 full companies in the initial assault wave, roughly 350 soldiers advancing across a front of less than 200 yards. Behind them, a 3rd company staged in the draw as immediate reinforcement. Piao had calculated correctly. The artillery preparation, which dropped over 1,600 rounds on Porkchop in the 20 minutes before the infantry moved, collapsed most of the forward trenches, and buried 2 of Harold's 6 automatic rifle positions under loose earth. Harold's 44 men had become something closer to 30 effective rifles before a single Chinese soldier reached the wire. The 2 60mm mortars fired until their ammunition ran out. That took 11 minutes. Sergeant First Class Mack Jordan grabbed a case of grenades from the blown-out supply point and dragged it through the communication trench on his stomach. The trench had partially collapsed under the barrage, reducing it to a shallow ditch filled with loose dirt and splintered timber, and Jordan moved through it by feel because the illumination rounds overhead had stopped and nobody on the American side wanted to fire new ones. Light helped the attackers more than the defenders at this point. Jordan reached the command bunker at 23:05 and found Harold bleeding from a scalp wound, directing fire from the bunker entrance with a carbine in one hand and the radio handset wedged between his shoulder and jaw. King Company arrived first. Lieutenant Joseph Clemons led them up the supply road from the main line at a run, single file, into Chinese artillery that walked back and forth across the route like a metronome. Clemons lost 8 men on the road before reaching the base of Pork Chop. He brought 53 up the hill. 45 made it to the trench line. The Chinese already held the northern bunkers and most of the crest, and Clemons could hear them talking, not shouting, talking, as they consolidated positions and prepared to sweep south toward the command bunker. The calm in those voices carried a professional confidence that Clemons found more unnerving than the shelling. So, what did American close-quarters technique look like against Chinese assault doctrine in a space this compressed? The trenches on Pork Chop ran 4 to 5 feet deep where they remained intact, with firing bays cut into the walls every 15 to 20 yards. Each bay held 2 men. The Chinese method for clearing these positions relied on a 3-man team, 1 soldier throwing a concussion grenade around the traverse, the other 2 rushing the bay immediately after detonation. Fast and rehearsed. The counter required someone in the bay to throw a grenade back around the traverse before the Chinese grenade landed. This produced a kind of mutual grenade exchange across blind corners that killed men on both sides with mathematical indifference. Jordan distributed his case of grenades to the surviving defenders in the southern trench section. 24 grenades split among 11 men. Love Company came up the road 40 minutes after King, commanded by Lieutenant Earl Denton. Denton's company took heavier casualties on the approach. The Chinese artillery observers had adjusted by then, dropping rounds directly on the road junction where it turned uphill. Denton brought fewer men to the crest than Clemons had. The records conflict on the exact number, somewhere between 30 and 40. The counterattack jumped off at 01:15 on April 17th. Clemons pushed north from the command bunker with what remained of King Company, clearing each traverse with grenades and rifle fire. The fighting produced a noise that survivors described differently depending on where they stood. Gruber called it clanging, which makes sense if you consider the M1 rifle butt striking a helmet at close range. Other men remembered screaming. Corporal Dan Grubb, a King Company squad leader, bayoneted a Chinese soldier in Bunker 7 and couldn't extract the blade. He left the rifle and picked up a carbine from the floor. None of this appears in after-action reports. Marshall got it from Grubb directly. Sitting in a tent 3 days later, Grubb's hands still bandaged from burns he'd sustained pulling a phosphorus grenade canister away from an ammunition stack. By 0200, King and Love companies held roughly 2/3 of the trench system. The Chinese retained the northwest bunkers and the forward observation post. Neither side could advance further. The fighting didn't stop. It reduced to a grinding exchange of grenades and small arms fire across 40 yards of collapsed trench that neither force had the strength to cross. Harold's SCR 300 reached battalion at 0220 with a request for continuous artillery fire on the northern slope to prevent Chinese reinforcement. The Fire Direction Center acknowledged. Within 6 minutes, 105mm howitzers from 4 batteries began dropping variable-time fused airbursts across the draw between Pork Chop and Hill 347. Each round detonated 20 feet above the ground. The northern slope of Pork Chop, from the crest down to the wire, looked like a construction site hit by a tornado. Timber beams jutted from collapsed bunker roofs at odd angles. Sandbag fragments mixed with loose earth in drifts 2 feet deep across what had been the communication trench. Somewhere under that debris, the bodies of Chinese assault troops lay where the variable time airbursts had caught them in the open during their reinforcement attempt. The airbursts worked. That's the blunt summary. Each 105mm shell flung shrapnel downward in a cone pattern roughly 60 yards wide, and 4 batteries firing continuous missions meant a new round detonated over the draw every 8 seconds. The Chinese 3rd Company, staged below the hill as Piao's reserve, tried to push reinforcements up twice between 0200 and 0300. Both attempts stalled on the lower slope. The bodies told the story at dawn. Clemons reorganized at 0245. He had maybe 30 effectives from King Company, plus whatever Love Company soldiers Denton could account for in the dark. The 2 lieutenants met in the command bunker. Harold had finally let a medic tape his scalp wound shut and agreed on a final push before daylight. The arithmetic favored it. Chinese strength in the northwest bunkers had degraded under the artillery, and no fresh troops had reached them in over an hour. Clemons divided his remaining men into 2 groups. One would push straight north along the main trench. The other would loop east, outside the trench line entirely, crossing open ground to hit the forward observation post from its blind side. That second group carried every remaining grenade on the hill. 14. The push stepped off at 0320. The men moving through the trench encountered something strange at the first traverse. Cloth bundles scattered across the trench floor, dark and round, roughly the size of an M26 fragmentation grenade. 2 soldiers dove for cover. Jordan kicked one. It split open. Rice. Cooked rice, packed into balls and wrapped in cotton cloth, carried by Chinese infantry as field rations. In the pitch dark, with adrenaline compressing every perception into threat or non-threat, a cloth-wrapped rice ball on a trench floor looks exactly like an unexploded grenade. Several men lost seconds, maybe 5, maybe 15, frozen against the trench wall waiting for detonations that never came. An irrelevant detail in the tactical sense. Nobody died because of rice balls. But it captures something about the texture of fighting in the dark that after-action reports never convey. The way fear turns ordinary objects into weapons, and the way your body believes it before your brain can overrule. The eastern group reached the forward observation post at 0335 and threw their grenades through the firing slits. The bunker's occupants, 7 Chinese soldiers, 2 of them already wounded, came out into the arms of riflemen positioned on either side of the entrance. One prisoner, a junior officer, whose name appears in the interrogation transcript only as Lieutenant Chen, told his debriefers through an interpreter that the American artillery had made reinforcement impossible after midnight. He used a phrase the translator rendered as iron rain. Chen said his company commander had been killed on the northern slope at approximately 0215, caught in the open by an airburst while trying to reach the crest with a platoon of replacements. The company commander's body stayed on the slope for 2 days before Chinese recovery teams retrieved it under a local ceasefire. By 0400, Clemons held the hill, the entire hill. Chinese forces had pulled back across the draw to Hill 347, dragging casualties. The smell on pork chop at first light defied clean description. Cordite layered over turned earth, blood oxidizing on cold metal. The sour sweetness of high explosive residue that clung to fabric and skin for days. Lieutenant Colonel John Davis, commanding the battalion from the main line, reached Clemons by radio at 0412. The transmission log records his message as 4 words. How bad up there? No question mark in the transcription. Clemons answered with casualty figures. Davis said, and this comes from Marshall's interview notes, not official records, "You held it. That's the report." Piao's plan had called for pork chop to fall in 6 hours. Clemons and roughly 70 men from 3 shattered companies made sure it didn't. The hydraulic fluid smell hit the replacement troops first. It leaked from a damaged bulldozer abandoned on the supply road, mixing with the April mud into something slick and chemical that coated boot soles and wouldn't scrub off. The men rotating onto Porkchop in the days after Clemons held it walked through that smell before they saw the hill itself, before they counted the splintered timbers or the dark stains on the trench walls that rain hadn't washed clean. 3 months later, the Chinese came back. The July battle dwarfed April's fight in every measurable dimension. 5 Chinese battalions committed across 2 nights. American reinforcements fed in at company strength until elements of 5 battalions held the hill. Artillery expenditure that exceeded anything fired in a comparable area since the First World War. The 7th Division's after-action summary for July 6th through 11th uses the phrase untenable attrition on page 4. Their phrase. The math had changed. With armistice negotiations at Panmunjom entering their final stage, 8th Army Command faced a calculation that had nothing to do with courage and everything to do with calendars. Why spend another 200 lives on a hill that would become a demilitarized buffer zone within weeks? On July 11, 1953, Major General Arthur Trudeau ordered Porkchop Hill abandoned. So did April matter? The question sounds rhetorical. It isn't. Trudeau's withdrawal order applied to a specific tactical situation in July, an outpost whose strategic value had evaporated because diplomats in a tent 15 miles south had finally agreed on a ceasefire line. April's battle occurred in a different universe, one where the armistice remained uncertain and every hill lost at the negotiating table translated into territory lost on the map. Piao's regiment expected to roll over a platoon-sized garrison and own the crest by dawn. Clemons broke that expectation with fewer men, less ammunition, no guarantee that reinforcement would arrive, and no clear picture of how many Chinese were already inside his perimeter. The Chinese learned on Porkchop what they'd learned at Shipyongni 2 years earlier. American infantry dug into a prepared position, supported by coordinated artillery, could absorb a regimental assault and throw it back. That lesson cost Piao over 200 casualties in a single night. It cost King and Love companies a combined 77 killed and wounded, from a force that never exceeded 100 effectives on the hill at any given moment. Clemons received the Distinguished Service Cross. Jordan got a Silver Star. Harold, who fought with a bleeding scalp for 4 hours before accepting medical treatment, received a Silver Star and a transfer to a staff position he didn't request. Grubb's hands healed. He stayed in the army. Lieutenant Chen spent the remaining weeks of the war in a prisoner compound near Busan, where declassified interrogation files show he answered questions about Chinese artillery procedures with what his interviewer called remarkable candor. The armistice took effect on July 27, 1953. Porkchop Hill sat empty, midway between the lines, its trenches filling slowly with rainwater. 97 minutes. That's the runtime of Louis Milestone's 1959 film, and Gregory Peck spends most of it crouching in a trench set built on a soundstage in Los Angeles. The sandbags look wrong.